Hi, I'm CVH with BetweenTheLanes.net, and today we're going to be talking about initiative. So, initiative is a concept that's very relevant to a long list of CCGs, and it's pretty imperative that you understand it if you want to be successful in Elder Scrolls Legends as well. If you're new to Legends or collectible card games in general, the first part of this video will be more relevant to you. I'll be basically defining initiative and talking about the ways different decks in Legends use the concept, different types of decks. In the second half of the video, I'll be talking about some ways the game design itself of Elder Scrolls Legends significantly impacts the quest for initiative that players undergo when they play basically any game of Legends. So without further ado, one definition of the word initiative, the one that's most relevant to card games, what we'll be talking about, is the power or opportunity to act or take charge before others do. So what this means in the context of a card game like the Legends, essentially, is that we're taking the board before the opponent can. Now, this doesn't always mean you're the aggressive player in the situation, but if you have the initiative, you're the one asking the questions, so to speak, and forcing your opponent to come up with the answers. The first person to play something to the board is said to have the initiative at the beginning of the game. So, let's jump right into an example. We'll use Daring Cutpurse, because it's a pretty it's a creature that sees a lot of play, and it's a basic creature without too many frills attached to it. So as an example, if we play a Daring Cutpurse onto the board and take the initiative early, our opponent may be forced into an awkward situation where they have to choose between playing their own creature or answering ours. Either way, this still results in you retaining the initiative in one form or another. So let's say they use their entire turn to play Crushing Blow on the Daring Cutpurse and kill it. The board will be clear for you to develop on the following turn as you did before and take the initiative again. If they answer your Cutpurse with their Cutpurse or another creature that has a similar size, you can use your turn to Crushing Blow their creature or potentially just trade creatures and develop a new one to keep the initiative going. So this gets tricky when you are unable to develop something further or answer their creature. You run the risk of the opponent developing in a similar situation that you did and taking the initiative back. This is generally what I refer to in a lot of deck texts when I'm just talking about what the deck's good at as fighting for the board. In reality, what I'm saying is that we're fighting for the initiative. This is why it's important in both Constructed and Arena to think about your Magicka curve and make sure you're not ignoring the early game completely, no matter what deck or what type of deck you're constructing, in either format. But different styles of decks do use the concept of initiative differently in their game plans, so let's just go over those. And we'll start with aggro. Good examples of aggro, of course, being aggro Battle Mage or Prophecy Assassin. These are basically the best decks at getting initiative in the early game, since their aim is to close out the game as quickly as possible. However, they are among the worst decks at what we just talked about, which is fighting for the board. Now, it has to happen a lot of time in the aggro versus aggro mirror matches, since the opponent will be just as fast as you are, but aggro typically loses games against the mid-ranger control decks when the opponent has a good enough start on the board as well, and the aggro player has to use a lot of resources just to keep enough things on the board to attack and deal damage with. Aggro decks have a ton of initiative in the very early stages of the game, but have to translate that into damage quickly because they don't have a good way to keep it up in the mid to late game. They basically don't have an off switch. And if the initiative is lost, which it likely will be if the game goes to a certain point, the game plan turns from fighting on the board to simply burning the opponent out with charge creatures or cards like Lightning Bolt, which just act as immediate damage. Nothing really. The initiative on board turns into just face damage at that point. Alright, so we move on to the next closest style of decks, which are mid-range decks. Mid-range decks are slower to get off the ground without a very optimal start. Sometimes, obviously, any deck can have this insane optimal start, but generally speaking, mid-range decks are slower than aggro decks. This is why a lot of them, such as the mid-range archer, are unfavored against the most powerful aggro decks. The thing they have in common with aggro decks is actually two. They are predominantly aggressive game plans and difficulty fighting for the board if the initiative has been lost, similar to what we just talked about with the aggro decks. However, in a stalemate, mid-range decks generally have a lot more tools to get far ahead as far as the initiative is concerned, because they use incredibly powerful creatures like Soulrest Marshal, Golden Saint, Blood Dragon, and Bone Colossus, which can basically just take over the board when you play them. So you can go from both players having nothing on the board to having a ton of initiative just with the drop of one powerful creature, since mid-range decks run so many powerful mid-game creatures. So this allows the mid-range decks to play for the later game much later than an aggro deck could, and maintain initiative long after an aggro deck would have run way out of gas. So as such, mid-range decks can often generate too much pressure for control decks to deal with, but aggro decks can get under the mid-range decks quickly with a faster curve before the mid-range decks can even really play those powerful creatures we were talking about, or before they have any relevance on the board. So now we move on to the polar opposite of the spectrum from what we just talked about with aggression, and we move on to control, which is the opposite from aggro, as it wants to play a very reactive early game as opposed to a proactive dealing damage early game. However, initiative is still very important, and it will try to get the initiative wherever it can. For example, if you have a Hive Defender in your hand as a control mage player against a clear board, you will definitely be playing it, but usually the battles are more two-sided because your opponent's unlikely to let you have a clear board facing you down. What allows Control to play this reactive early game is the way it's able to stabilize in the later turns and swing the initiative back around if it has been lost, which it likely will in the early game. So cards like Ice Storm, Manticora, and even Heal like Pillaging Tribune are great examples of this, because their efficiency allows for huge tempo swings, which give the control deck time in the late game to turn their card advantage into board advantage and initiative. Healing effects like Tribune are actually very essential to this, since the fastest decks, like we've talked about, will be turning their early initiative into face damage, like aggro decks do. Many of these stabilizing effects are too weak to combat the stream of threats from midrange, but are a reason why control is favored against most aggro decks. The control mirror matches are why initiative in the early game matters the absolute, or where initiative in the early game matters the absolute least, since both players know the other deck is capable of stabilizing against a fast early start with cards like Ice Storm, Manticora, and the heals like we just mentioned. So instead of trying to get the initiative, both control players will probably be playing defensively and outmaneuvering the other as far as tiny little card advantage swings are concerned, to at least have a lead in that going into the very late turns. But eventually, the player who's farther ahead can start trying to mount an offensive and make that attacking push over 1 or 2 turns. Initiative does matter a lot in the late game still, as plays like a successful Odoving or Marak Dragonborn can make for very swingy turns and force the opponent to play defensively, and we've talked about this before when we were looking at Manticora, for example. If you Manticora their Manticora, and then they Manticora your Manticora, it's basically a battle of initiative. Alright, so now that we've talked about how the decks use initiative, let's just get into Legends itself, because Legends is, while it has a lot of similarities to other card games on the market, it does have a few serious differences. And the two of the biggest differences from Legends and other games from a gameplay perspective are the rune system and lanes. So both these have a huge effect on the way initiative is taken, and it stems from having viable comeback mechanics. A lot of the most unfun losses in any number of games, from Hearthstone to Magic or whatever, come from opponents having fantastic curves in the early game, and yours just being that much worse to where you can never really take the initiative back and you eventually lose. The Elixir of Magicka in this game can actually sometimes make that even worse, or it makes it seem worse, because an aggressive player with a good curve who's going second can aggressively just use all the charges of the Elixir on the first 3 turns to play a 2-drop, 3-drop, and a 4-drop on turns 1, 2, and 3, and make the early game that much more insurmountable. But both lanes and runes do help to combat that. Let's talk about lanes first. So lanes can be a saving grace in a game where you've seemingly lost fighting for the board, particularly in aggro or mid-range mirror match. If the opponent just gets a bit farther ahead than you in one lane to where you'd know you'd have to spend way too many resources to take it back and keep up, the option remains of splitting the assault, so to speak, and moving into the other lane. This isn't generally as optimal as simply having full control of the board and the initiative, but it offers a viable racing strategy that gives you a solid shot at winning a game that you might otherwise not, even if you don't have great comeback mechanisms in your deck, like a control deck. Excuse me, this is something we see a lot in decks like Midrange Archer and Prophecy Assassin. Lanes are also very important in the early game, because if you start with a 3-2 against a clear board, you have to decide where you want to put it in this game. Typically, you actually want to develop in the field lane as opposed to the shadow lane. Now, this might seem obvious to a lot of you who've been playing for a long time, but it is something that I frequently see new players mess up. And when I was a new player, I did mess this up as well, so I wouldn't feel bad or anything. But typically, you want to develop in the field lane as opposed to the shadow lane first. You have initiative either way, but you're more likely to control the following turns and maintain that initiative if you put it in the field lane. So here's why. If your opponent answers your 3-2 with their own 3-2 in the same lane, you have the option of trading creatures or going to the face either to push damage or use an action to kill the creature that they played. If your opponent puts a creature in the shadow lane, maybe they decide they don't want to contest your 3-2 or they don't have anything they want to be trading into it, you can then develop in the shadow lane as a response to their creature. Your new creature will have cover, their cover will wear off, and on your following turn you'll again be able to decide whether or not you're wanting to trade or go face with the creature. This gives you the best shot at maintaining the initiative, although of course it doesn't account for your opponent simply playing a bigger creature than yours in the same lane, and that's of course where things get interesting and make every game of Legends unique. The last and probably most controversial difference we'll notice in Legends compared to other card games is definitely the prophecy keyword. Prophecies allow for some of the most important comeback potential in the game, while they can be upsetting to a degree when the opponent has 3, 4, or even 5 prophecies, and they're all good ones in a game. They are able to be accounted for, since we can even look up the number of prophecies and what they are in the game, and you can play around most of them to an extent depending on your game plan. Obviously, some decks can play around them better, some can play them worse. If you've lost the initiative early due to having a poor hand while the opponent's threatening to run you over, getting a powerful prophecy creature like a Moonlight Werebat or a Fate Weaver can really swing the initiative back around. Even a good enough action can sometimes stem the aggression from your aggressive opponent long enough for you to use the rest of your cards in hand to stabilize. Even though Piercing Javelin's not going to be putting anything on the board to take the initiative back, it can slow them down long enough for your hand to actually be able to keep up with theirs. Now, it might seem like it's unfair to aggressive strategies in particular, but a lot of the biggest swings come in the aggressive mirror matches where a prophecy prevents one player from being able to run over another player simply because the opponent drew slightly worse. This is really important because it comes back to what we talked about the unfun losses. A lot of those do happen when both decks are just trying to play like a good mid-range strategy or a good aggro strategy, and you don't always want that to be decided by the slightly better hand. So having the prophecies that you are able to play around to an extent do offer some comeback potential there. In these games, it also makes the order of attacks very relevant. While the control decks with the most relevant defensive prophecies benefit from these mechanics, they do in fact need them, as their early game is often too weak to make for two-sided games against aggro or mostly mid-range opponents by itself. In control mirror matches, the prophecies typically do little to help and actually seem a little weak, so it does balance out in a way. Especially when you consider that the control decks will be very rarely actually hitting the prophecies. So not only can they deal with them a lot easier, they just can simply ignore the prophecy keyword entirely until, like I mentioned, they're going to make that 1 or 2 turn push and finally try to close out the game on like turn 15 or something. That's basically the importance of initiative in this game. A lot of it really comes down to making sure you're making the right plays, thinking about when you're expending resources, if it's really worth it to take over a lane that's been, your opponent's been dominating it, or if it does make sense to move and at least have the initiative in the other lane. Think about prophecies in particular, not only when you're attacking but in deck building. A lot of people in Arena, I think, undervalue prophecy still, and just having one prophecy in your runes is very unexpected, since most Arena decks do have to be towards the mid-range of things, and racing can often get to be happening. If you take over one lane in Arena, your opponent will likely just develop in the shadow lane, start trying to race you, and having those prophecies in your deck is going to make it much harder for them to do so. So I would definitely take prophecies into consideration when you're considering building your Arena deck, as well as your constructed decks. Really think about, not only when you're playing things first, obviously there are some exceptions to these rules, like if you have something that you need to be protected from a charge, and you know your opponent's playing green, so they're likely playing Cliff Racer and Tazcad. These are things to consider, but of course, at the forefront of your mind, especially if you're playing an aggro or mid-range deck, should be maintaining the initiative, and if you're playing a control deck, it should be all about finding the right time to play those swing cards like Ice Storm and take the initiative back from your opponent, because that, in essence, is how games are won and lost in this game. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, hopefully it was helpful. If you did, feel free to check out other strategy content on the site and on the YouTube channel, and I will see you next time, guys.